Hello, brain and behavior students. Welcome to part 2 of your lecture on the structure of the nervous system. In part 1, you will recall that we discussed some basic features of the nervous system. In this lecture, we are going to focus on structures and functions of parts of the brain and the spinal cord, being mindful to identify structures of the forebrain, the telencephalon and diencephalon, and talk about their functions. We're also going to identify areas and functions of structures in the mesencephalon. We're going to think about the different functions of metencephalon and myelencephalon structures. All this will make sense to you by the end of the lecture. We're finally going to describe how the spinal cord works and the important anatomical structures therein. In part 3 of this lecture for Unit 2, we're going to talk about the peripheral nervous system specifically. But for now, focusing on structure and function of the forebrain, the midbrain, the hindbrain, and the spinal cord, it's important to note that, I recognize these terms are really confusing. They are foreign terms and they seem to lack meaning. Cerebral cortex probably is readily apparent to you, but this other stuff about forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain, never mind telencephalon, diencephalon, and so on. What I want you to know is that these groupings exist because they make sense developmentally, and they link human brain anatomy and function with that of lower organisms, which, as you know, often function as models for human brain and behavior. So the forebrain, early on in development, and the next slide will drive home this point, the structures that are apparent include the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. Over time, early on in embryonic development, the hindbrain differentiates into the fourth ventricle, and then this can be identified or differentiates into regions that are better described as the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. The metencephalon comes to include the cerebellum and the pons as the brain further differentiates during development, and the myelencephalon becomes the medulla oblongata. So early on in development, we use these major divisions, and then as time goes on developmentally, by the time, let's say, the human fetus or the rat pup is born, we have more of these regions represented. So the midbrain first becomes a cerebral aqueduct. It then is called the mesencephalon, comes to include the tectum and tegmentum. The forebrain unfolds into the lateral ventricle and the third ventricle. The lateral ventricle becomes the telencephalon, the third ventricle, the diencephalon. The telencephalon importantly differentiates into principal structures including the cerebral cortex, the basal ganglia, and the limbic system, which we will discuss in detail. The diencephalon becomes the thalamus and the hypothalamus, which we will also talk about momentarily. So this is what the brain looks like over the course of development. This is an illustration from another textbook, but you can see that early in development, we have really just the ventricular system. This is the ventral side, that's the dorsal side of the brain. And in this dorsal view, you can see that we have on the nose or rostral end, the forebrain. In the middle, we have the midbrain. and the hindbrain is in the caudal end of the brain. This is the beginnings of a brain. The next stage of development here is B. Here's the dorsal side again, and the ventral side down here. And at the top, you can see from the dorsal perspective, the telencephalon has gotten larger. There's a posterior gradient so that the brain is growing disproportionately larger in the rostral end. And then you can finally see the diencephalon. It emerges here, and the mesencephalon is visible, and the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. So these regions are suddenly identifiable in the developing brain. And here is the human brain at birth, and all these brain regions have become subsumed by a very large cerebral cortex, and we can see the linkages between these brain regions in the human and analogous brain regions in other organisms. So in this illustration, we have the telencephalon and the diencephalon shown. The telencephalon includes most of the two symmetrical cerebral hemispheres, which make up the cerebrum. So all of this blue stuff is called the cerebrum. The cerebral cortex around the cerebral hemispheres, kind of like bark on a tree. It has lobes. We'll talk about the 4 lobes in much detail over the course of the semester. They include the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, which you can't see here because it's on the other side. It's on this is a mid-sagittal view, and it's on the outside or the more lateral. The occipital lobe is in the back here. So we have occipital, parietal, frontal, and on the flip side, the temporal lobe. The cerebellum is what you see there, and the brainstem is down here with the diencephalon encompassing that region in red. So in this coronal slice, you can see a number of important things. First of all, this is the temporal lobe right here. And I wonder if I can mark up. I'm going to use a pen to mark up. This is the temporal lobe. You can see in this coronal section the gyri and sulci. So the gyri are the big bumps, and the sulci are the depressions or grooves. And evolutionarily speaking, we are able to pack more brain real estate into a limited skull, a size-limited skull, by introducing these complex folds or convolutions. So the sulcus is the groove, and that's singular sulcus, sulci plural. Gyrus is the ridge, and that's the singular is gyrus. Gyri is the plural. The white matter is inside the cerebral cortex, and that is this area here that is lighter in tone, and it is really the connections between neurons, and the gray matter is the cell bodies, and that's what you see that's slightly darker on the outside. So a fissure is a sulcus basically that's very, very deep, and so there are some important fissures that are used to demarcate main areas or the lobes. So this large fissure here helps us note the boundary between the temporal lobe, and which is here, and the parietal lobe, which is up here. You can see 3 of the 4 lobes better from this perspective. The temporal lobe is more visible here. The parietal lobe is hard to see because it's at the top of the head. This is the ventral view, or a basal perspective, a basal view of the brain. The dorsal view is where you can see the parietal lobe. In this basal view, there's some important things. We can see a cross-section through the midbrain, which is in here. We can also tell that the limbic cortex surrounding the central part of the midbrain is in here. We can see the temporal lobe, as I mentioned before, which is in green. We can see the frontal lobe over here and the occipital lobe in the very back of the brain. The 4 lobes are easier to see in this particular mid-sagittal image because we still have some of the temporal lobe down here. We have the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, and the frontal lobe all represented. This mid-sagittal view shows the forebrains around the cingulate gyrus, which is this area here. And that is part of the limbic cortex. It's called the limbic cortex. And it's going to be very important later on when we talk about emotion. And the occipital lobe we will mention momentarily as being involved in functions such as vision. So here is the lateral view of the 4 lobes, the occipital lobe here, the temporal lobe here, the frontal lobe, and the parietal lobe up here. So this lateral view is important because it reveals to you a part of the brain that I've alluded to before called the prefrontal cortex. And that part of the brain is really important for executive functions, such as planning and impulse control and working memory. And in this lateral view, you can also see the premotor cortex and the primary motor cortex here, and the primary somatosensory cortex there, and also the somatosensory association cortex and the visual association cortex, as well as the association cortices for vision down here in the temporal lobe, and for audition or hearing right here in the more dorsal part of or superior part of the temporal lobe. The other important thing that you can't see because it's hidden from view is the primary auditory cortex, and that's highlighted over here in green, although it's mostly hidden from view. So I want to talk about the forebrain and the telencephalon. So these are the same things. The primary visual cortex back here receives visual information. The primary auditory cortex receives auditory information. The primary somatosensory cortex receives information from the body senses, except for the olfaction or smell sense and gustation, the taste sense. And we'll take a closer look at the primary somatosensory cortex in the next slide. So in this slide, you can see we have a lateral view of the left hemisphere over here and the right hemisphere on this side. And in this lateral view, you can see the primary motor cortex in purple and the primary somatosensory cortex in blue. So the primary motor cortex and the primary somatosensory cortex control movement and sensation from the feet, the trunk, the hands, the fingers, face, lips, etc. They are separated by the central sulcus, which is right in between here. And that's a messy drawing, but the central sulcus divides the primary motor cortex, which is in the purple, from the primary somatosensory cortex, which is in the blue. So this is called the precentral gyrus, the part that makes up the primary motor cortex, and the postcentral gyrus is the part that makes up the primary somatosensory cortex. The primary auditory cortex lies below the primary motor cortex and the primary somatosensory cortex. Remember, it's down here. And the primary visual cortex is found at the caudal end of the brain, back here in the occipital lobe. The calcerine fissure on the visual cortex, right here, is important because it helps you mark where the visual cortex, the important regions of the visual cortex begin. So these fissures are large divisions. So here's the lateral fissure. This lateral fissure tells us that's the beginning of the temporal lobe. And the central sulcus is kind of similar. So it's like a fissure, not quite as deep as a fissure, but helps you to demarcate major sections of the brain. Again, continuing with the forebrain, you can see that the sensory association cortex, back here in gray, receives information from each of the primary sensory areas. It has circuits of neurons that analyze received information. Perception takes place and memories are stored there. Regions close to the primary sensory areas receive information from only one sensory system. And that will become apparent later on in the semester when we talk about sensation and perception. Continuing along with the telencephalon, the motor cortex, which you see in purple here, mostly directs in controlled movement. It's located in front of the primary somatosensory cortex. And we will talk later on in the semester about movement and some really interesting phenomena associated with phantom limb sensations and pain that can be alleviated in a mirror box where you move an absent appendage using the mirror image of the intact limb. So the motor association cortex is a region of the frontal lobe that's rostral or closer to the nose relative to the primary motor cortex. And it's also known as the premotor cortex right here. It's involved in planning and execution of movement. The primary motor cortex is shown in this illustration as a region in the posterior frontal lobe. Again, its rostral end is the premotor cortex. And you can see here we have the prefrontal cortex at the very front. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is at the top. And the premotor cortex is over here, more rostral to the primary motor cortex, which is here. And so this would be the primary sensory cortex, and so on. So the telencephalon, or forebrain, is divided in a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. And it's important to note, so here's the right hemisphere and here's the left hemisphere. Certain functions are lateralized, meaning that they are controlled by one side of the brain. So the cerebral cortex is what we see on the outside here. It's connected by the corpus callosum, which is this dense bundle of fibers in the middle, and that carries information from the right to the left and vice versa. The left hemisphere analyzes information from the right. The right hemisphere analyzes information from the left. This is an interesting adaptation of humans, that we have, reverse or opposite controls for many functions. So, for instance, for writing, movement of your right hand is controlled by the left hemisphere. Movement of your left hand is controlled by the right hemisphere. The vision, the information received by the right visual field crosses, part of it crosses through this optic chiasm into the left hemisphere, and vice versa. So you see the visual cortex in the back of the brain. The left visual cortex processes information from the right visual field, and the right visual cortex processes information from the left visual field. And this is really interesting in terms of certain visual illusions that are experienced, particularly in the case of neurological patients with injury to specific parts of the brain, that can allow them to see and yet not see important aspects of the world around them. In this mid-sagittal view of the brain and the spinal cord, we can see that the top of the spinal cord, so here's the spinal cord down here, and we can see that the top of the spinal cord joins the medulla, and which further goes on to become the midbrain. So here's the medulla right here. And it goes on to become the midbrain, which includes, for instance, the pons right here. So between the medulla and the midbrain and toward the nose is an egg-shaped area called the pons, and that's this egg-shaped area here. Around the same level and to the side and opposite the pons is the cerebellum. And the cerebellum, if we could dissect the brain, you would see that the pons is really a huge bundle of fibers that helps relay information from the cerebellum to the rest of the brain. So the cerebellum is sometimes called the little brain, and the pons is a major structure in terms of integrating information to and from the cerebellum. So between the cerebellum and the medulla is a narrow strip like choroid plexus, which is also illustrated here in your visualization. And above the fourth ventricle, above the midbrain, is the third ventricle. So the ventricular system is easier to see from some perspectives as opposed to others. Immediately above the third ventricle is the thalamus. And at the center of the thalamus is the massa intermedia. So here is the thalamus right in here, and at the center right in here is the massa intermedia, and you can see the choroid plexus appears in red. So the four lobes of the brain surround the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is, again, this big bundle of fibers that connects the right and left hemispheres. We're going to watch a video about the split brain procedure that hopefully will illustrate the significance of the corpus callosum, particularly in symptoms associated with epilepsy. And, when it's dissected or divided, we can learn some very important things about the lateralization of brain functions. In this mid-sagittal view that's slightly rotated, you can see highlighted the limbic system, which is really important for emotion. So as well as learning. So the limbic system is located around the edge of the cerebral hemispheres, the middle edge of the cerebral hemispheres. It is basically a group of brain regions that includes the hippocampus, and the amygdala is involved in learning and memory and emotions. So in this particular illustration, you can see the pons, which we talked about before, and the cerebellum, which we also mentioned. You can also see the midbrain up here, and the thalamus and the massa intermedia are also illustrated. The important limbic structures include the fornix, the mammillary bodies, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and this limbic cortex right in here, which is important for making sense of a lot of and integrating a lot of the information from regions such as the amygdala and the hippocampus. The basal ganglia, again, are part of the diencephalon, part of this sort of larger grouping that is the forebrain. In the basal ganglia, we have a group of subcortical nuclei in the forebrain that are involved with the control of movement. And they include the thalamus, which you see sort of blown up over here, and also the hypothalamus. In your textbook on Pearson is a really useful simulation of the limbic system that is worth viewing. for now, we're going to move on to a discussion of other parts of the forebrain, comprised by the diencephalon, which is the second major division of the forebrain, and surrounds the third ventricle. It includes the thalamus and the hypothalamus, which we've mentioned before. The thalamus projects information to specific regions of the cerebral cortex and also receives information from the cerebral cortex. The hypothalamus is very important for the control of autonomic nervous system and endocrine functions. It produces hormones that control the release of hormones further down in the gonads, the testes and ovaries, and in the adrenal glands. So being engaged in fight or flight responses, regulating stress hormones, a discussion that we will continue in the coming unit. The pituitary gland actually receives input from the hypothalamus and produces neurochemicals in response to its stimulation or command by the hypothalamus. It's a bulb-shaped gland that is very important, frankly, for the control of the neuroendocrine system, is very significant behaviorally, and we'll talk about that again later on. As part of this illustration, you can also see the mammillary body, which I mentioned is an important component of the limbic system in general. The midbrain includes two major brain regions, the tectum and the tegmentum. The tectum is the roof or the dorsal portion of the mesencephalon. So you see the mesencephalon illustrated here. And its principal structures are the superior and inferior colliculi. The tegmentum is the covering, per se, of the mesencephalon, and it consists of the reticular formation and the rostral end, and some nuclei that control eye movements, and the periaductal gray matter and the red nucleus and the substantia nigra. So these you can see more readily in the next slide, which shows you, for instance, that the substantia nigra is so called because it stains black in histological assays, and the red nucleus stains red in histological assays. So this illustration shows you from various angles the cerebrum, right, the forebrain, and the important underlying structures of the brain stem. And we can see from the lateral view of the semi-transparent brain. So here's the lateral view, and this is the semi-transparent part. We can see the thalamus. We can see, so the thalamus is up here in the frontal perspective. We can see the midbrain, the pons, the medulla, and the cerebellum. Here's the cerebellum back here, and the medulla is in here, right? And these are blown up for you, cross sections via these arrows. So you can see in figure C the dorsal view of the brain stem, that allows you to take a closer look at parts labeled, such as the thalamus, right? The medulla over here, the cerebellar peduncles, which you would be interested to see in a dissected tissue. These illustrations are actually much more compelling in tissue specimens, and on Moodle we have some atlases that you can use as an additional guide or reference. So in this visual, I have listed some other important regions of the hindbrain, including the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. So the metencephalon includes the cerebellum, which is this area here, and that receives visual, auditory, vestibular, or movement and balance information, as well as somatosensory information about individual muscle movements. It integrates this information and modifies the motor outflow, exerting a coordinating and smoothing effect on movements. So this little brain is basically very important for movement. The pons is a large bulge in the brain that relays information from the cerebral cortex to the cerebellum, as I mentioned before. The myelencephalon includes one major structure, the medulla oblongata, which you've probably heard of before. The medulla is important for vital functions such as the regulation of your cardiovascular and respiratory systems. So your breathing, the pumping of your heart are controlled by the medulla oblongata. And also skeletal muscle tone is controlled by the medulla oblongata. The spinal cord is that second part of the central nervous system. So the first part being the brain and the spinal cord being the second. Both are encased in bone, remember? The skull in the case of the brain, the spinal cord is encased in sort of bone cage, if you will. So the spinal cord itself is a long tube-like structure that distributes motor fibers to effector organs, so to glands and muscles that have an effect, that produce movement or secretions. It also collects somatosensory information from the periphery to take back to the brain and help us make sense of things that we touch or feel through our limbs. It contains some reflex circuits, which means there's certain self-preserving abilities that we have that are taken care of at the level of the spinal cord, so we don't have to overthink life or death situations, such as removing your hand from a hot surface. It's composed of a vertical column with 24 vertebrae that are fused, and also spinal root. So from top to bottom, the main part of the spinal cord is divided into three parts. There are the cervical vertebrae. So vertebrae is plural. Vertebrum is singular. And so here we are with the thoracic vertebrae and the lumbar vertebrae. We also call these the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar regions. The sacral region or the sacral vertebrae are down here, and they are fused, as you can see, pointing into a coccyx, which is what's left of our tail, evolutionarily speaking, and is called the tailbone. So The important thing to note is that the spinal cord passes through an opening in this column, and you can see a cross section of the spinal cord in this last slide. And in this slide, figure A shows a part of the spinal cord with the different layers. And figure B, which has lost its label right here, shows a cross-section of the spinal cord that highlights ascending tracts in blue and descending tracts in red. So the nerve fibers go in different directions depending on whether they are carrying or taking away information from the main relay centers in the spinal cord or the brain. One thing you should notice is that the meninges also exist in the spinal column. We have pia mater and dura mater, right? Just as we do in the outer layer of tissue protecting the meninges that protect the brain and separate the brain from the skull. And flowing through this arachnoid membrane in similar fashion is also cerebrospinal fluid.